This is probably one of the cooler projects I've ever done. I was able to talk about history with people I don't really talk about it with. So I started with talking to my grandma. We talked about the Kennedy assassination, which was when John F. Kennedy was parading through Dallas, Texas, and he was shot twice in the head by Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald carried out this attack because he did not like the American political system and had ties back to communism. So my grandma told me that she was in college at University of Dayton when a boy came running down the hall with a boombox that was blaring the words, "The president has been shot, the president has been assassinated." No one in the class knew what that meant. She's talked about how her professor didn't even know what it meant and how they were all just scared. And she didn't really even think that the president could be shot. She didn't really think about how the president could be assassinated. That was the first time in her life where she learned the lesson that just because you live in the U.S. doesn't mean you're safe from everything. And that's something that's very important to learn. I think everyone's learned it. I've learned it recently with the pandemic. Speaking of the pandemic, when we talked about it, she kind of establishes the theme in these interviews that everything is going to be okay. And I asked her, what do you think is going to become of the world in these next few months? And she says that things are never going to be like they were before. They're never going to be back to that old normal. And that she's okay with that as long as things can be safer for the future generations. And I think that establishes a theme for the rest of the interviews because we hear a lot about how everyone's okay with how the world will change as long as things become safe and we learn from mistakes that put us in bad places. Next, I interviewed my dad. When I told my dad I was going to interview him, he couldn't really think of anything from the Cold War that he could bring up that was relevant. So I told him, think back to anything. He eventually thought of the Miracle on Ice. The Miracle on Ice was, of course, the gold medal game between the USA and the Soviet Union that was sort of big because there was tension between the two countries and nobody could really express that tension in an overt manner. So they did the next best thing. They played sports, and that was big for everybody. My dad was at his high school basketball game, and he said you could hear the entire time. The USA was up. It was big. It was big. And he finally knew they won when the chants USA broke out across the gym. And he told me that this moment didn't really define him as a person and that he didn't really carry it on into the future, which I think is something that's very real to say because we never really see things like that in history. A lot of people like to play things out larger than they actually are, and my dad kept it very real. He talked about how he didn't really think that any of that was that big of a deal at the time. And so I asked my dad the same question as my grandma about COVID. With everything he's been through, what does he think is going to happen in the future, and is he okay with it? And he said that he doesn't think anything will be the same, like anything at all, and that he's okay with that because now he's going to have programs that can help save his restaurant if something worse than COVID happens. It can help keep him in business, and so he's happy about that. And he thinks that, and that speaks to our theme of as long as things are able to stay safe and we're able to learn from the past, it will ultimately be better than before. My third and final interview was with my cousin Delia, who's 23 years old. She doesn't remember much from 9/11, but she was able to tell me about how her dad frantically picked her up just to go back home and watch the news. The September 11th attacks of 2001 were when 19 members of radical terrorist group Al-Qaeda hijacked several airplanes, crashing 2 into the World Trade Center in New York City and forcing both buildings to collapse. One struck into the Pentagon, and one struck into a field in Pennsylvania. More than 3,000 people died, and thousands more were injured. It takes place during the domestic and foreign policy changes of the 2000s. The attack happened because Al-Qaeda wanted to prove a point and incite rage and terror. Delia said that as she grew up, she remembers seeing change whenever she did several different things. When she went on vacation, when she went to the store, there were more police officers, there were more people at the airport. Every single time she did different things. And she remembers seeing the change and not really recognizing what had happened until she saw the confirmations that bin Laden had been killed in the newspaper. And she asked her mom, what's the big deal? And so she finally realized that all of this had been happening for a good purpose. So I drove that conversation into asking her about how she thinks COVID will end. And in no surprise, she gave a very similar answer to my grandpa and father. She said, to my grandma and father, she said that she thinks that we're going to have to be doing all of these things for a long time. There are going to be periods where we're going to have to social distance a little and where we're going to have to get vaccines. And it's going to happen fairly often. And she said as long as things get safer, she's fine with it. Which proves that the theme of 3 different generations is more, let's be safe and learn from the past. And we learned that through the interviews I constructed. For the first question, I want to say that this project has shown me how historical events can show us how we need to act in order to know what to do in times like today. We saw how there were violence, and the Vietnam War is a perfect example. We saw how badly veterans were treated after that, and we've started to treat them better, even though that condition and treatment hasn't gone to the best of our ability. And the history affects my personal identity because it is able to teach me how to act and how to properly identify things that are wrong and things that are right. Like, I can call out racism and be able to call out people that are wrong because of these things we've seen in history. And personally, I agree with my grandparent, dad, and cousin that I think COVID will influence my perspective in 20 years, and I'll be grateful that we had to go through all of this because we wouldn't have had more deaths and more sadness over years and years and wouldn't have had to deal with it, which I'm very fortunate for. I thank you for letting us do this project. It's helped me a lot with understanding my place in the world and my future place in the world throughout all this COVID.